Here we want to talk about how macroeconomists study key questions. To answer this question, we want to look at the procedure for doing economic research, especially for macroeconomists. The first step is to document the facts. The second step is to develop a model. The third step is to compare the prediction of the model with the facts. The last step is to use the model to make other predictions. So what I want to do now is to go through each steps in detail. So here we say documenting the fact is the first step for macroeconomic research. And I want you to think about why that is the case. Well, that is because macroeconomics is part of economics, and economics is also belong to social science. Therefore, when we want to come up with research question, we need to observe what happened in our society or around us, such that we will be able to know what we are studying. But for macroeconomics, it is about the social phenomenon of the aggregated economy. We want to look at how aggregated households are making the decision, how the aggregated firms are making the decisions, and then they interact that in the market, and then we know what happened to the economy, what is the economic performances based on the interactions of those agents. But it is difficult because it is hard to observe the aggregated behavior of individuals. This is different from microeconomic studies. That is because the microeconomic study is observing the behavior of individuals. Therefore, the researchers can go to look at the behavior of one individual and then come up with the conclusion. For example, we can ask one person to go to the market to decide whether or not they want to buy a bottle of water, and then we ask them to go to the market to buy the second bottle of water and ask them how much they are willing to pay for the first bottle of water versus the second bottle of the water, and then we may find that the price they are willing to pay will decline as the number of the water bought increases. And that is something related to the decreasing marginal utility of individuals. So that's something that we can observe directly. But for macro, that is not that easy because we are observing the behavior of the aggregated individuals. So then what we can do? Well, what we can do is that we can go to the government statistics. There they have the summary statistic of the behavior of the individuals. For example, we know how much is the aggregated consumption. We also know how much is the aggregated output. And then based on those statistics, we may be able to come up with some idea about what's going on in the economy. So the purpose of documenting the fact is to develop research questions. So in here, I want to give you two examples about how to documenting the facts in macroeconomics. So the first graph that I want to show you is related to the rapid growth in Taiwan, and then so we can continue to ask questions related to growth. The second graph I want to show you is related to the wage in Taiwan, and then I will show you one wage phenomenon that we observed recently and then develop a research question. So for the first graph, I show the GDP per capita for Taiwan versus US. Even though the data ended by 2004, that's okay because it already captured the fact. As you can see in here, that the red line represents the GDP per capita for US from 1800s to 2004. And the blue line represents the GDP per capita for Taiwan from the early 1950s to 2004. As you can see from here, that the GDP per capita for Taiwan in the early 1950s is about the living standard or the level of the US in 1800s. However, after about 15 years, the living standard of Taiwan is about the US level in the 1970s. Therefore, in here, we know that Taiwan is growing fast in the past 50 years. Why? That is because for US, it takes about 150 years to grow the level Taiwan completed from 1950 to 2004. Therefore, we can claim that Taiwan is the economy experienced rapid economic growth. So then, follow from this graph, we can say, so then why Taiwan grow fast? To answer this question, then we can go to the next step. The second example is about the wage in Taiwan. As you can see in here, the wage grew rapidly from 1980 to 2000s, but then after 2000s, the wage is remained roughly constant. We call it a wage stagnation. So then an immediate research question following this fact is that why Taiwan has wage stagnation? So then to answer this question, we need to move to the second step. But before that, I want to summarize these slides. In here, we know when we documenting the fact, it provides us the motivations for a research question. And that is very important because it links our research to what we actually observe in life. So once the motivation of the research is clear, we can move on to the second step, which is about developing a model. When we develop a model, we want to answer why the fact or the phenomenon we observe it happens. For example, for the case of rapid growth, we want to know why Taiwan grows fast. When we look at the second graph, which is about the wage stagnation, we want to ask why there exists wage stagnation. The answers to these questions will help us learn from the good examples and avoid the mistakes. And then it will be able to promote the economic performances of an economy. When we talk about developing a model, we need to know what is an economic model. An economic model can be a composite of different equations. But before we talk about the detail of an economic model, you can think about it as a black box. And then we are going to have some input and then have some output. And you can also think about it as a toy economy, such that it will help us understand the world that we live in and get clearly about the relationship of each economic variables that we are interested in. So why we say it is a toy economy? Because it is not exactly like the real economy that in function, but it preserves some of the key features of how an economy should function. So it's more like the kid's toy. The kid's toy kitchen has the stove, but it never burns. It has knife, it never cut. But the kids still can learn how to cut and how to cook. Same thing for a toy economy. Based on the toy economy, we will be able to know how individuals make decisions, how they interact, such that they affect the performance of an economy. So then, what is the purpose of using an economic model for a research? We know that the economy is something way too complicated. When we want to understand how different agents in the economy interact such that it ends up with the fact or the phenomenon we observe, we in fact cannot play around with the agent. We say, hey, please make different decisions, and then I will be able to observe what will happen. May it be different or not? We cannot do that for social science. So then to answer the question about, for example, how to promote economic growth or how to prevent wage stagnation, we need to set up a model that mimics the basic framework of an economy. And then we can perturb some of the factors and then see when we change the behavior of individuals. For example, the households decided to work more, will it be able to promote economic growth? So then once we can perturb some of the variables, then we will be able to see what will be the outcome. So then from the model, we will be able to play around with the economy and then see clearly the causality. So that is the purpose for using the model for analysis. So up to this point, we have a rough idea what is an economic model. We also know why we need economic model. Then before we talk about the composite of an economic model in detail, I would like to go through the third steps and the fourth step before I go into the details. So once we have a model developed, we then would like to compare the model prediction with the facts that we observe. Why that is so? Because we need to check the performance of the model. If the model prediction turn out to be completely different from the fact, then the model is not working well. A model doesn't work well, will not be able to give us an insight, or it won't be a good toy for us to play around with to check whether or not perturbing some of the variables will be able to result in the effect that we want to generate. I would like to say, when playing around with the toy economy that doesn't generate a prediction with the fact, it's as if a kid is driving a toy car that when you steer the driving wheels to the right, then the car will turn left. Then as a kid, can you imagine playing with such kind of a toy? You probably don't want to play with that because it's not at all like the real world. So that's the same thing for the economic model. If the model prediction is not consistent with the fact that we want to focus on, then the model is not at all useful in helping us understand the effectiveness of a policy or the causality that we try to understand. So this is a very important step for model development. If the model prediction doesn't do good with the facts, then we need to modify the model, and then until the model prediction is consistent with the economic fact that we want to focus on. So in fact, when writing a paper, up to this part already take you a lot of time, so it can already be claimed a completed paper. However, once you publish your paper, your theory or your model will need to be checked later on by the later scholars. So the fourth step of the economic research is to use the model to make other predictions and see how the prediction works. And so the purpose of this step is the future work that people can follow up and then see whether or not the theory is a good theory. If it is a good theory, it means that the model prediction of a causality or the effectiveness of a policy will work again and again in human history. If that is the case, the theory will become a classic. So this is a very important last step of the economic research. It completes the loop of research, but if you may notice that it can be completed by different people. Now I would like to move on to talk about the last part of the procedure for doing economic research by talking about the composite of a model. So what is an economic model? To begin with, we know that model need to have the input and then the output. But then what should be the input and what should be the output for an economic model? We say that for the input, we have a name for it. We say the first one is called the exogenous variable. The second one is called the parameters. So what's the difference between these two types of input? For an exogenous variable, they are the inputs that are allowed to change but taken as given from outside of the model. So once you know the quantity of the exogenous variable, you just put into the model and then it's going to spill out the outcome. You cannot change the value of those variables. But then what are the parameters? The parameter is an input that is generally fixed over time. So the main difference between an exogenous variable and a parameter is that the exogenous variable are allowed to change but taken as given, but for the parameters, it's generally fixed over time. And again, it is also taken as given from outside of the model. However, it doesn't mean that the parameters cannot change. Sometimes we also need to change the parameters. The purpose for changing the parameters is for doing the sensitivity analysis. Because we make assumption, for example, that the capital share equals 1/3 and it's generally fixed over time. But then we may think that, well, is that true that the capital share is fixed over time? What if the capital share got changed from 2/3 to 1/2? How will that affect the result? For that case, and to answer that particular question, then we can change the parameter to see whether or not our research results are sensitive to our assumptions value for the parameters. If it is not sensitive, that is great because your result is robust. However, if your result is different when you adopt different parameter values, then we may cast more doubt on your research results. So for a complete research, a lot of time, if we make assumption for the parameters, we usually need to do the sensitivity analysis to know whether or not our main conclusion remained the same when the parameters got changed. Okay, so that's about the inputs, exogenous variables and parameters. Now let's look at the output. So what will be the name for the variable under the economic model for the output of the model? We call it an endogenous variable. The definition for endogenous variables are that they are the variables that the model tries to explain or try to solve. So for example, if we are interested to know how much goods are produced in the economy, we know that we can have a model for the production process. In micro class, we call it the production function. And then once we know the value of the capital and labor, we put into the production function, and then we are going to have the quantity of goods that is produced, and which is the number for the endogenous variable of the model of production function. If you may recall from the micro class, you may learn the production function like this. You know y is equal k theta L to the power of 1 minus theta. The y is the output, the k is capital, L is the labor. Then what is theta? Theta is the capital share and 1 minus theta is the labor share. Under this model, the production function, the endogenous variable is the y, that is the output. The exogenous variable is the K and L, that is the amount of the capital and labor that you put into the production process. The parameter is theta because it is fixed over time. So that's an example of an economic model. If you still find it difficult to understand, I would like to give you another example. For example, we know that when we want to produce water, we need to have the hydrogen and the oxygen. So then the model for the process producing water will be that you need to put in 2 units of the hydrogen and 1 unit of the oxygen. You put it into the vase. So in this example, the number or the quantity of the hydrogen you put into the vase for producing water, and the quantity of the oxygen that you put into the vase for producing water will be the exogenous variable. The parameter is the environment that you set, which can be the 100 degrees Celsius. Once you burn it, or probably 400 degrees. Then once you set a fire, you burn it, and the hydrogen and the oxygen will be combined together, and then boom, water comes out. And the quantity of water that comes out will be the endogenous variable. I hope this example will help you understand better the structure of an economic model. We have three major components. One is called the exogenous variable, we have parameters, and we have endogenous variables. This completes the discussion related to the procedure for how macroeconomists are doing research.